Welcome back. After the short video clip, we have with us Reggie Kelly. Reggie Kelly is a great friend of the International House of Prayer. He's come here many, many times. He's helped us with difficult passages, kind of giving us understanding and moving forward. And his passion really is to see a generation walk in clarity and walk in love for Jesus. And so I just would like for Reggie to introduce himself a little bit, tell us who you are, where you're from, who you worked with in the past, and kind of how you got into this, studying the end times.
Well, it actually all began with something of a, right away after my salvation, it began with a bit of a, what might be called a preterist crisis, because I had read in Matthew 24, this generation, that greatly exercised me. What's going on here? Is this something interjected by Matthew, or is the Lord's timing here in question? Something like that. And I'd heard recently at that time, Billy Graham had just said on television in those days that, the Lord may not come for 100 years, maybe 200 years. I said, why not make it 1,000, Billy? I mean, this is just open-ended out there somewhere. And that concerned me, and it was I just cried out to God continually. It was a big deal. It was an existential crisis of a kind. And so what I happened onto one day at work was Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. And when I read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, I had my eureka moment when Paul said, and now you know what withholds or holds back, and had a little bit different take than popularly than understood from many commentaries. I took it that Paul was saying that the Lord cannot come until this man comes in his appointed time. That just like Jesus had come in the fullness of time, this man had a time. And I looked around, I saw the modern world and all that, I just thought, this is when man is at his apex, when man has come to his Babel height, that this is man in his ultimate hubris and so forth, and it's the day of the climax of the day of man, the kingdom of man. And it was just simple to me that a plain person's plain reading of 2 Thessalonians 2, like Brother Brown just said moments ago, that you put anyone in a room and without coaching or guidance or whatever, however proficient or non-proficient they are in original language, they read that, no one would come up with the idea that, either the Lord can come any moment, or that he might just, or that there's not something definite that signals his return. And that's something we might come back to in a moment, Jacob. You mentioned earlier the issue of deception. Is there something definite? Is there a plain person's plain path, a plumb line of simplicity that can keep us on course when everything is going to be pledged against it? But back to my relationship with Art Katz, as you mentioned, and so on. Well, I heard some of the early messages. I think it was the Elijah message by Art Katz that kind of put him on the map, that came out of the Jerusalem Conference on Prophecy, and Catherine Kuhlman and many names were there. Cute story. They said, speak 4-5 minutes, and he read it 45 minutes, and they were fuming. But that message was so powerful. It yet so matched up and agreed with what we already living in a Christian community in Texas. We were kind of already into this because of the 2 Thessalonians, the Matthew 24 connection, and Jesus sending us, I would argue, to the book of Daniel to search out and find this event that he identifies. And so this just began to open up not just end times, but reaching all the way back to the covenant with Israel and all the way to the end of exile and the whole big picture. I call it the glory of the story. Yeah. And it's more than just the practicality of avoiding deception, of which Jesus gives that powerful antidote. Behold, I have told you all things. And so don't go after these other secret chamber rendezvous or anything else that's presented to you. Stay on course with what I'm giving you here, but do this. If you do nothing else, first do this. He says, whoever reads, go let him understand. But what's he speaking of? He's actually sending his disciples to Daniel to search out this particular event, knowing that when you identify and understand that event, he says, whoever reads, understand.
You're referencing Matthew
24:15, correct. But that event appears 4 times in Daniel. It appears 8, 9, and 11, and 12. And 4 times it appears, and Jesus well knew that those who would search that out would see what comes before it, and there are events that come before it, and what happens after it. And then they would likely begin to see many more things. And so it's not just the practical of escaping deception, though that's eminently practical. It's the glory of God. It's it's that come and see relationship of the manifold wisdom. And this is part of the mystery that comprises the whole mystery of the two comings and so forth, which are seen as a kind of we've been in the last days. But this is the latter end of the last days, and there's a sealed vision. For the larger part, of course, was revealed at Pentecost and thereafter by the Spirit sent down from above, 1 Peter 1, 11 and 12. But at the end, there's something yet to be further unsealed, that is sealed all the way to the end. And the way that word end is used throughout Daniel pretty consistently, it has to do with the ultimate consummation, the absolute end of exile, the long estrangement of the Jewish people from their covenant promises. And so
it is interesting when you're saying that Jesus refers to Matthew 24:15, the abomination of desolation is set up. Read Daniel, and then you read Daniel, and then you read the book of Revelation, and you realize, man, they're all talking about the same thing. So Jesus is really telling us, hey, in his time, in Jesus' time, obviously the book of Revelation hadn't been written. So he's telling his disciples, hey, go study Daniel. In 60 years from now, I'm going to give it to the book. I'm going to give it to John, and I'm going to expound on it.
right.
And on top of that, I'm going to tell you, hey, study these two books hand in hand. And if you study the book of Revelation, it is literally the only book in the Bible that has the promise of blessing attached to it. So literally, Jesus tells us, go study Daniel, which leads you to the book of Revelation, because they kind of go hand in hand. They have the same kind of imagery of the beast and the kingdoms and so on and so forth. You need to have them both in order to understand it.
That's right.
And then Jesus says, if you do that, you will be blessed.
And furthermore, he is investing the very, in Revelation chapter 12, it talks about Satan being cast down by Michael. Remind me if I forget, because I'm a little bit of a senior now. When Paul says, let no man deceive you by any means, I'm going to argue that he has very much in mind exactly the warnings of the Lord. But let me come back to that. But first, this issue in Revelation 12, Satan is in some sense, has still an access of residency in the heavenlies, from which he's never yet been fully removed.
Yeah.
And at the midpoint, we would say, of the week, but even if you don't understand or see the 7 years, it's somewhat in discussion these days, at least see the half week. Because the whole book of Revelation is constructed around the half week.
Yeah.
3.5
And that
years.
derives, obviously, from Daniel's half week, which Daniel identifies not with just tribulation in general, which is the character of the whole age, but the specific tribulation that begins, the one that's unparalleled, the trouble that is without equal, without parallel, like never before and never again.
And he puts clear definition on that time by saying
Right.
this is the times time and half a time. 1,260 days
Right.
and 42 months is in
Right.
Revelation.
Revelation 11, 12, and 13.
Yeah, so when you're
Right.
talking about the
Free check.
half week, it's in
Exactly.
addendum with those numbers.
And I think, a fancy word, but what I would, what's called a crux interpretum, means a key primal passage that just literally holds you on course and deals with the specificity. Because if there's anything I see at risk these days, is an opaque and vague view of Antichrist and the tribulation. And some are committed to a view of kind of a historic premill, but of an imminence, because whoever the bad guy doing the persecution happens to be around at the time, and then the Lord shows up, well, then that must have been the Antichrist or whatever. So.
Right.
And then the pre-trib view, well, you can't have imminence unless you have, a pre-trib rapture. There's a solution to that, a good and sufficient one, by the way, but, I'm losing my track here. That's my problem. But back to the casting down of Satan, his time of great woe to the inhabitants of the earth, that's that concentrated, limited period of time. That's at the very end, not just the general whole age-long tribulation. So the 3.5 years is very important. Now, that's approximate, because there, as you know, there's that mysterious extension at the end of Daniel chapter 12, 11 and 12, where it's expanded. The 1260 that we know so well from Revelation is expanded to 1290 and then even 1335. And I really believe this is what the Lord particularly had in mind when he said, of that day no man knows the hour. He was not unclear about the general duration of that half week. He knew very well. So what is he speaking about there, the day and the hour? He could only, in my view, have reference to the precision, the exact day and hour. And so I think that's what we're talking about here. There is an approximate time that can be known, and there will be a time to know the time.
Yeah.
And it's not time to know the time until those signs are clearly in evidence. So there's no concern about jumping the gun if you keep clear. And this comes back to 2 Thessalonians 2. So Paul was dealing with the problem of jumping the gun, of a premature excitement, and so forth.
Yeah.
I wrote
and he's literally saying, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, he starts out, don't be easily shaken. Don't think the rapture has already come. The resurrection of the saints doesn't happen until the man of lawlessness is revealed and the great falling away has happened. He's giving us two massive indicators.
Let no one trouble you by any means. Correct me on this if I'm wrong, and this bears verification, but I think I recall that the only other place that exact Greek word is used for being troubled is actually in Matthew 24. All these things must happen. See that you be not troubled.
Yeah.
So check me out on that, but I think that's right. The point is, Paul is saying, so what moves Paul with such urgency to begin to just so attack this error that has cropped up of that the day of the Lord is already either, and it's a translation question here, it's either immediately upon us, about to happen, like not like the pre-trib that could happen anytime, but more than that, it's like it is right upon us.
Right.
And that's the context of enesticate, which is also translated, like in some translations, at hand. Others take that word and it's like the day of the Lord is already here. And it is translated in Romans 8 as things present. So you could legitimately translate it either way. There's another, but the thing Paul is jumping on there, and he is concerned not just as, and many of the commentators are satisfied to just say, well, Paul is correcting this hasty agitation and the distraction, and it's creating idleness, and people are leaving their day jobs, so to speak, and so just calm down and all that. No, he is seeing the portent in this view that the Lord's coming is already here in so-called over-realized eschatology, or rather, I think more likely the translation is that it's immediately at hand, very shortly to happen, so therefore, he's about to appear.
Yeah.
Don't let anyone trouble you. The end is not yet, basically. But he says this, he said, but take you heed, behold, no, that's Jesus, I'm sorry. He says, let no one deceive you by any means. And I believe we can argue that he has in mind the deception that you'll be vulnerable to if you are not regarding what he's laid down. And what is Paul doing in 2 Thessalonians in his 3 weeks there, as you said, Jake, earlier? In his 3 weeks there, he was careful to review with them what Jesus had laid down about this man who's going to go to the temple. And I would just urge anyone, how can you exegetically disconnect or detach 2 Thessalonians 2:4 from Matthew 24:15? You've got to do that to have these ambiguous views of a tribulation. But if you understand, because Paul's writing around 51 to 53 AD, that's one of the most clearly dated books of the New Testament, and the temple at Jerusalem was famous, was one of the wonders of the world at the time.
Yeah.
And yet we're to read by many people's reckoning that Paul has another kind of temple entirely in mind, completely disconnected to the temple in Judea, which is going to be desecrated according to Daniel's prophecy. Oh, no. You go back and you read the very language that Jesus would use verbatim, word for word, out of Daniel 11:31. Well, about 5 verses down, and this is what really opened things up for me as a very young man. About 5 verses down, you have the willful king who exalts himself. And throughout Daniel, the prince that shall come is the self-exalting one. That's the one that takes away the sacrifice, which is a real key, by the way, to understanding the 70th week process.
Let's jump back for just a second here, because you mentioned some key themes and topics that I want to hone in just for a second here. Because you said, okay, we can know the time of his coming. And Paul talks about don't be deceived.
Approximately.
Approximately. We don't know, obviously we don't want to put dates and stuff like that on it. But we can know the general time frame. Jesus himself says that in Matthew 24:32 and 33. Look at the fig tree. When the fig tree bears fruit and brings forth leaves,
That's right.
spring is coming, summer's coming, and it's at the door.
He's not coming without the preceding signs.
Okay, so
That's the tip-off.
Give us some preceding signs that you see, one, in the Bible, and two, happening in the world right now. Obviously, that doesn't mean that Jesus is coming back tomorrow, but what are some signs that you see clearly in the Bible and that have escalated in our time, even just the last, obviously Israel is a gigantic sign, Israel being in the land, but are there some other signs that you see now? Those are like massively escalating on a global scale right now, and it alerts me.
Well, we've already touched on many. Michael was just now, so much that's happening in the moral culture and so forth, but that's, evil men and seducers have always been. So all these things are general. And but as far as something very specific, I know if I had a little time to think on this, I'll even think of things better than this. But right off the top, it would be the amazing alignment that's going on right now in the Middle East with nations like Iran, Turkey, and so forth. Here's Turkey, a longtime friend of Israel that's turned belligerent only very recently. And Turkey is listed as among those great nations that will bring the final aggression on Israel. Interestingly, on a secure Israel. And a deep debate there. Is this millennial secure? No, I urge that this is the covenant with death and hell. And that Israel will have entered into a basic deal with the devil.
Can you add the references just for people listening?
Daniel 11, verse 23 says, after this league or alliance is made with him, this will be the little horn, the contemptible or vile or despicable person.
Antichrist,
yeah. That's in verse 21. The Antichrist comes up into somewhere within the area of the ancient Seleucid Empire. And
where's that?
The Seleucid Empire at the time of Antiochus IV, for example, went all the way from Damascus to Babylon.
Yeah, so all the way from Israel, just so we have a picture, all the way
so
from the Mediterranean Sea, Israel, all the way over to Iran. It's a giant landmass.
Exactly, and many of the great prototypes of Antichrist and Isaiah, he is called the Assyrian. And to show that Isaiah is not just putting that back with something antiquity, Paul literally quotes verbatim Isaiah chapter 11:4, where the stem from Jesse in Isaiah 11 verse 1, the Messiah, the scion of David, actually destroys not just the wicked in general, which is the general impression you get from, but in the Septuagint, and Paul will quote the Septuagint in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 8, it says, he will with the breath of his lips destroy the uppercase U, uppercase O, ungodliness, ungodly one. And that's why in many of our translations, it will show that Paul is saying, then shall that uppercase W, wicked, be revealed. So this is the personal Assyrian, the Antichrist, who's destroyed by the voice of the Lord, and not by a sword of a man. And that's in Daniel, that's in Isaiah. So we're dealing with the Lord's triumphal return to destroy the ultimate man of sin. And this clearly is Assyria. So this is moving now from the presumptions about a revived Roman Empire over into the realm of an Islamic Middle East. Yeah. And so back to your question, and I have so many rabbits that they're all juicy to me. I just chase them everyone. But anyhow, your question about what's currently going on, that just in the last few years, I would also say it looked like during the Morsi reign there of terror and the high jihadist attitude toward Israel and all, that things were going that way with Egypt. But Isaiah 19 is very clear that Egypt will suffer the same scourge and violence and devastation of Antichrist that Israel will suffer.
Little wonder. There's even whole cities that will call upon the name of the Lord.
Totally. Yeah. And the situation, the timing of this, in Isaiah 11, Isaiah 19, my goodness, it's in Zechariah 10, this is the return of the Lord, when the great waterways will be dried up and the penitent surviving remnant of Israel will come back on foot or dry shod. In other words, so something powerful has happened of a world upheaval that has rerouted or done something, perhaps nuclear, the way of the kings of the East. This is literal stuff. Yeah. And you see it not just in Revelation 16, but you see it, and this is the very end. So the slain Antichrist now with the destruction, and here is Egypt, the surviving remnant of Egypt. These are Egyptian people who are having the same revival and coming to faith that the Jews are having when they are going apart each one to mourn at the sight of the one they fear. So powerful, tremendous convergence there. And they've suffered the same bitterness of the same cruel hand
Yeah.
of this cruel Lord. And all that language there is unmistakably the final persecutor, the oppressor, aggressor. So this is the deal. So Egypt has now become moderate and very favorable of a
Yeah.
peace arrangement, which is not the whole issue of this covenant that's made firm. That's a complexity about that, and we won't take that time now. But sort of the receptacle of a true recognition of Israel, which is indeed a holy covenant, that these final aggressors will be so incensed and despised, and that the Antichrist will court those who have this mutual hatred and unite them against this covenant. But that is also housed or protected by a peace arrangement.
Yeah.
And including it among the many, and some would interpret that many Jews or whatever, but I would say many nations are likely participants, and you
Right.
would probably, except for other bases, you would not recognize necessarily the Antichrist as yet you would have reason to know that he was one of many nations that was recognizing and confirming and allowing this peace arrangement that gives Israel this false and deceptive peace that allows them to actually build their temple, or begin to build their temple, because that's all that's necessary, and to prepare for the restoration of the sacrifice.
Yeah.
So,
So you're talking about the first 3.5 years, right? We talk about there's going to be, according to Daniel 9:27, there's going to be 3.5 years of
Right.
peace treaty of the nations. They're all aggressive towards Israel,
yeah,
but somehow the Antichrist is maneuvering around. It says he's a little horn, so he's in the background a little bit. We don't know exactly what he's going to do and his key role in it, but he will confirm a covenant
Right.
with many nations around that are aggressive towards Israel. And Israel is like, okay, let's sign the deal. It's awesome. Turkey's not going to attack us. Iran's
and
not
that
going to
will
attack
be,
us.
Jacob, the covenant with death and hell that will allow this false, disarming security that will be suddenly overthrown, unexpectedly overthrown, by this 10-nation assault.
Yeah.
And then begins the 42 months, then begins the 3.5 week of the trampling down of a very familiar motif from the prophets, this last treading down, which coincides with what the prophets will call the travail of Zion, or that ultimate trouble that Daniel. I mentioned a moment ago this word crux interpretum. I would say that anyone who wants to spread the tribulation out over some long and definite period needs to deal with the fact that Jesus puts it beyond the abomination. So, and many scholars, of course, put that at 70 AD. A lot of problems with that.
Yeah.
But in any event, they even admit that the Great Tribulation is to be distinguished from the general tribulation that all Christians endure.
Right.
Huge point. And then in Daniel 12:1 and 2, he says, and at the time, Michael, this connects us back for anyone who has this kind of stamina and focus. I mentioned earlier the Revelation 12 casting down of Satan. Well, it says Michael stands up in Daniel 12:1. And then, when he stands up, will be a time of trouble. Abomination is not particularly mentioned. But if you go to Revelation 12, you find out what's going on. Michael's standing up in the relationship to a final cosmic war in the heavenlies that thrusts Satan down, so that now he is no longer has this access, but he's restricted now for this little time, this little
Yeah.
season. It says a short space.
He
a
knows
little
his time is
His
short.
time is short. So this is that concentrated 3.5 years by every reckoning, and it ends with two things that need to be always kept in view. Not only the deliverance of Israel, is there a future deliverance for Israel? You betcha. But the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
You cannot disconnect exegetically, and the so-called full preterists know this very well. You can't disconnect the resurrection of the dead. And if Daniel 12:2 is not a literal reference to the resurrection, where would you find it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you can't disconnect that from the tribulation without parallel or equal. And so this is the kind of simplicity I think we have available. So Jesus is sending us to Daniel. And then when we see Daniel, we're going to see when Michael stands up. We're going to see this final half week. And we're going to see this Antichrist, which is not spread out all over history, a line of popes or some other system of evil. But this is a man who has a literal individuality. He's a military. He's a leader in that region of the world. And he unites 10 nations against Israel. And so where was I? So this is a the end part of the life of an individual. His career is 3.5 years. And even if you were to make that a mere symbol, I urge that you wouldn't, because Daniel, to me, 11:2, that talks about the detail of these days,
Right.
not just 1290, 1335. To me, that rather rules out just making this a sliding scale of symbolism and so forth. This is intentionally detailed to leave it unmistakable. But we're talking about a literal period that starts with the abomination and the cessation of the sacrifice and ends in nothing less or short of the resurrection of the dead.
Yeah.
I mean, Daniel's not going to say the return of Jesus, of course. That was a further mystery to be revealed
Before
in the New
his
Testament.
time.
Yeah.
But the famous day of the Lord of the Old Testament becomes the day of the Lord's return in the New Testament. So,
And I think that's excellent. And I
Yeah.
think, too, it was just reminded me, too, in Matthew 24, where Jesus clearly says, like, and these days will be cut short for the sake of the elect because of the intensity of what we're going to be facing in that time.
Oh, that's
and
a
so
huge
I think
point.
I was just reminded of that it's going to be very, very intense. And the Lord says, like, there's not going to be a tribulation as has ever been until this particular point. And thank goodness it is limited to those 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also jumping off that point is we do have to remember that we see Daniel, Revelation 12, we see Satan cast out of heaven, but Satan has great rage against the church, but at the same time it says now the kingdom and the power of his Christ have come.
Right.
So there's that dichotomy, that weird thing when we think about, the end times, we think, okay, let's buy a house in the mountains and store water and buy lots of guns and shoot everybody who goes on our property, But it's actually the exact opposite. Jesus is saying, no, I'm revealing myself in the greatest measure possible in that time. My power is present. When there's no
Exactly.
water because of the judgment, you strike that rock and have water come out and feed your neighborhood,
I like to say you can run, but you cannot hide.
Yeah, exactly.
He is your hiding place.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If he's not your hiding place, all the other things are vain and futile.
But it's just like that. We kind of have to bring that into our conversation a little bit, the victorious church aspect, because we've been so long inundated with the negative. It's all going to hell in a handbasket anyways. Let's just get out of here, But Jesus is saying, no, that's the greatest hour
It's
for
the
church to
church's
shine.
finest hour, to
Yes.
quote Winston Churchill.
Yes.
It's the church's finest hour. It will be glory unspeakable, because with Satan cast down, the accuser of the brethren no longer has access to the courts of conscience. Something that's true now. But there'll be a depth. We talk about this issue of there's so much here, but there's something about when the church is ultimately weak, it will be ultimately strong.
Right.
And that same transitional time, at the same time, the masculine now are being mighty and doing exploits. Masculine is a word for
Yeah,
those who
explain
wise
that
and
real
understand to define that. But it says they will be strong. I don't like this translation. It just simply says they'll be for. It actually says they will be strong and do great exploits. And it says
That's Daniel 11, 32 and
32 and 33. And they that understand will instruct many. And through that instruction of many, it says in Daniel 12:3, they turn many to righteousness. Well, interestingly, it says in Revelation chapter 7 about who is this multitude that comes out of. Now, here's the key. In the Greek, it's the double use of the definite article. And I can't remember just now, but there's those that can document this who are linguists, and they make great point of the fact that this is the Great Tribulation, not just tribulation in general.
Right.
So during this time, we can look for a multitude beyond human. This doesn't mean you can't calculate on a computer, but in other words, by human observation, this is beyond calculation.
Yeah.
That's how many myriads are coming into the kingdom of God. Interestingly, at the same time, paradoxically, of the greatest falling away, which I don't believe is, by the way, confined to mere Christians. This is a world rebellion. So more on that later. But during that very falling away and this time of great delusion will be one of the greatest harvests of people coming into Christ, which brings a point that you brought up. Gabriel, about shortness of time and how you said, stay with it. It takes time. We're going to need something someday when you have to hit the ground running.
Yeah.
And when people are going to need to grow up overnight rather quickly.
Yeah.
And where they won't have access to seminaries and endless literature and so forth. And I submit that part of that key will be when we will observe and obey with great urgency what Jesus said, go to Daniel.
Yeah.
Because not only does Daniel open up the end times, it opens up the whole it opens up the whole covenantal history of Israel.
Everything. It opens up the
All
gospel.
the way to the end of
Yeah.
the exile, which rabbis call the redemption. It brings that whole conspectus into view and goes back into the Deuteronomic curses and blessings. That whole Song of Moses, that whole thing comes in with this great long question, how long? Because really what you see with the souls of the martyrs in Revelation is really the question that's burning, and then Daniel sees, yes, my people are going to go home, but they won't be home free. They're going to go back, and there's still yet future a day of the Lord. In the meantime, there's this march of kingdoms.
Yeah.
So he was really getting his people ready for the long haul.
Yeah.
But it would get worse before it got better, but it would get glorious. Now back to the point about glory. At the very same time, the dragon is being cast down and now confined to his short time on earth. That's the very same time the two witnesses receive
Yeah.
power. Isn't it interesting that in verse 31 of Daniel 11, there's the abomination. The very next verse says, exploits, power, the people of God are going to be anointed
Yeah.
and are going to be overcomers. Now, how then does Revelation says they'll be overcome? The interesting thing is, yes, in terms of their natural bodies, but as they're being outwardly, externally overcome, they're being wonderfully overcomers in the Spirit. And they'll be free from fear, free from accusation, free from condemnation, because the clarity of the gospel, it won't be a new gospel, it won't be something entirely new, but on a wide scale, there'll be such a depth of breaking and freedom for the people of God.
Amen.
When they will see these things, the massive fulfillment of so much compelling prophetic evidence. And I believe one of the first things that attracted me to Mike was his discussions. I caught this one time. Somebody said, sounds like you, Reggie. And it was something on the power of prophecy and evangelism.
Yeah.
See, his first love is evangelism. I believe that's mine. Prophecy is totally subsidiary to that. The glory of God being uttermost, but the issue of evangelism, the early church, the apostolic approach was always to take the scriptures of the prophets and expound those. And what was good for the Jew was good for the Gentile. And used prophecy as the great attestation where people's hearts would burn within them as the scriptures would be opened.
Right.
This is the approach that I think we're going to see as we're pressed to. Oh, now we left the conversation. Okay.
We're actually out of time.
All right.
Thank you so much.
So
No,
much good,
There's so much good stuff.
content.
Thank you so much. I love that point that you made. The church is going to enter into a depth of the gospel like never before, and they will be
Apprehension.
overcomers
Yeah.
in the last 3.5
That's
years. So with that, we say thank you so much, Reggie Kelly.
Yeah.
We're going now to Dr. Craig Keener, and he's going to talk to us about his book, Not Afraid of the Antichrist, and then later on he will talk about Matthew 24. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the evening.